For instance, Caucasian faces take them to a totally different culture where that culture is exposed to those types of faces. We find the same results. These faces with these facial features are perceived as significantly more attractive than other faces. Without those features, infants even prefer faces with these types of characteristics, even though they haven't necessarily been exposed to it. Again, what does this sort of suggest about where this comes from, where physical attractiveness sort of stems from, or why we prefer these types of faces? Is it socialization, or is it more meaning?
More like a biological instinct, your form of it.
Right. Right, more of this probably evolutionary psych explanation. If to the extent that we find it cross-culturally, it argues that there's some evidence that maybe we are born with it for one reason or another. Maybe for evolutionary psych reasons. We can also talk about additional research that supports these results. For instance, in one study, what they did was they took faces. So here we've got a single face and a single face. And then they started morphing them with other faces in this computer software program. So here we've got a face that's been morphed with 4 other faces. Same here. Here's faces morphed with 8 other faces. Here are faces morphed with 16. Then we present these faces, these images, to participants and ask them to rate them in terms of physical attractiveness. And what do you suppose we find? What sorts of faces, on average, are perceived as more physically attractive than other faces? Absolutely. The more morphics, the more physically attractive we tend to rate those faces. Basically, we associate averageness with attractiveness. Why do you suppose this is? What's happening to these faces as we morph them?
The more you morph, they tend to lose their singular asymmetries, and then they become more special.
Absolutely. The primary explanation is symmetry. Right? The more we morph, the more symmetrical we're going to get those faces to be. We're going to weed out those idiosyncrasies on either side of the face. Maybe even dull down some of those prominent features that might not be so attractive. Make them a little bit more attractive. Is this making sense? Again, our goal, the theory behind the evolutionary psych perspective is that our goal is to find a successful mate, one that should be likely to produce successful offspring that will survive. To the extent that we can find individuals who are healthy, that's a sign that they should be successful in producing genetic offspring. So we also know that there's a stereotype about physically attractive individuals. Anyone remember what we refer to this theory as? Stereotypes about what personality factors co-vary. Absolutely. An implicit personality theory, right? Is what this is. Implicit personality theory. Which is what is beautiful, is good. It turns out to be the case that, yes, there is a stereotype about physically attractive individuals, which is that they are happier, more social, more sexually responsive, more intelligent, more successful. Again, that notion of what is beautiful is good. Right? We tend to implicitly trust beautiful people a little bit more than the less beautiful people, right? They seem a little more trustworthy, a little better. What do you suppose? I mean, we can talk about various explanations for why this is. What's a sociological or a social psychological explanation for why there might be socialization? Yeah.
I think if a person is more beautiful, it's going to change the way they're treated throughout their life, which will actually end up furthering a stereotype. Because they will actually end up living a stereotype.
Ooh, interesting. Self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So is there any truth to these stereotypes? It's one question, and it turns out, well, we'll skip ahead. There is a little bit of truth. It turns out that attractive people are, on average, somewhat more socially skilled than less attractive. We don't find the differences in terms of attractiveness and other dimensions, but in terms of social skill, we do. the big dress. You know, I wanted the simple, simple type of dress. Of course, my sisters, my mom convinced me to get the complete opposite. You know, the incredibly huge, poofy cupcake style, huge dress. So at first I wasn't sold on this idea. You know, it's got limitations in certain terms of going to the bathroom and all sorts of. It requires money. But I actually ended up really enjoying it because what I didn't anticipate was how little kids would react to that. Right? Now, imagine a little kindergartner awestruck and implicitly trusting me. This kindergartner does not know me from Adam and told me I'm going to be with you and I'm going to be around you, right? I'm like very, very trusting, very implicitly, I will go with you. And probably because of, these stereotypes, whether or not they've been indoctrinated with them, whether or not they were born with these attitudes, but consider what they were exposed to on TV, for instance. In Cinderella, what's the message? Who's the good person in Cinderella?
Well, I mean, I'm not certain who's the person, but I know that Cinderella doesn't get the princess until she's beautiful and has a great dress. And I mean, the witch is always ugly.
Right.
Stepmom is always ugly. She
In
has
fact, they're called the ugly stepsisters, right? And they're also evil, right? They're definitely less attractive than the good, beautiful Cinderella, right? Who was rewarded for her beauty at the end by wearing a big poofy dress and she gets the prince.
It's not like that in Native American version.
What's that?
It's not like that in Native American version.
Ah. Okay, I'm only familiar with this. Yeah. Is this making sense? Okay, so we've got benefits. Again, these stereotypes, these actions, again, possibly could turn into those self-fulfilling prophecies groups. We should also talk about potential drawbacks, though. Yeah, there are these benefits to being physically attractive. Could you imagine some potential drawbacks being very physically?
They may not know what it is. Rely on themselves.
So do the ways in which people interact with them affect them in possibly negative ways? Possibly. Yeah.
When people like trying to attract people for help in certain situations, people they have no idea what to do and they give the wrong answer and they give the wrong response, and then that in turn leads to a greater backlash. Well, they should have known what to do. They should have known to like we see celebrities doing something wrong, like oh my gosh, they forgot to put a hat on their child and it's cool outside. How dare they? And like it's so irresponsible and people are holding that all the time.
So if we violate expectations, we know we don't like it when people violate stereotypes about their own group. So maybe that's perceived as more negative. They violate those types of stereotypes. Possibly also included in this stereotype, more sexually responsive. Maybe certain drawbacks could be unwanted sexual advances, right? To the extent that they have this stereotype about this person, that could be a potentially negative consequence as well. But on average, arguably the benefits I think outweigh the negatives for the most part. That quote, "Don't hate me because I'm beautiful." It's probably not too much possibility that will happen given what we know about them all. All right. So questions though about this so far? In terms of physical attractiveness, yeah, we do know that there's evidence of an objective form of beauty. But do you think it is entirely objective? And if so, why or why not? There are some guys that are like, oh man, he's like 6, and then like after 50, he's like, oh. So sure, individual differences in what we perceive as physically attractive. Absolutely. We're just talking about averages here. Right? Not everyone's going to agree with everyone else on what is the most physically attractive person, or whatever the most physically attractive features. What sorts of things do you think might predict whether or not we perceive people as physically attractive?
There are some crossover things that we can do, like
when they presented participants with a series of opposite sex photos of individuals, and the independent variable was whether or not they took that person's own face and morphed it with those other faces. And it turns out that when their own face was morphed with the other person's face, they actually liked it significantly more than if their own face wasn't morphed with that other face. Again, maybe not necessarily the best thing that we should do, but supports that notion of familiarity. That's it. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I know it's a little like off a little bit, but like, does that have to do the same thing like some people look like dogs? Like I know people who like have like pets that look like them that have exactly the same correlation as well.
I don't know about that. That would be interesting though to see if the physical features of a person actually does correlate with the physical characteristics of the dog. Maybe we're drawn to similar types of dogs or similar styles of dogs. That would be interesting to test. But we do know that similarity is a big potential attractor. So maybe even similar to the extent to which that person isn't entirely perfectly objectively beautiful, but really similar to us. Maybe that's going to shape whether or not we perceive beauty. Right? Absolutely, we know beauty isn't totally objective. We know it because if we merely do things like tell participants that you're going to meet this person in the future, we rate them as more physically attractive. If we simply see that person more, guess what? We rate them as more physically attractive. It's called the mere exposure effect. Their objective face isn't changing, but our subjective interpretation of their physical beauty is changing. Right? We become more familiar with them, and a little bit more comfortable. So it turns out that there is some evidence that its attractiveness is not completely objective. Because obviously the more we see them, the more we get to know them, the more physically attractive they are. In fact, the more we like them, the more physically attractive we rate them to be, compared to other people who don't know them, don't like them quite so much. Have you ever found, for instance, that at first you didn't really have a strong or even solid attitude about how physically attractive someone was until after you really got to know them, really started to like that person as a friend, and then you sort of perceive them as more physically attractive. It changes our perceptions of how beautiful they are, right? I've certainly seen this in my own life. Have you ever even seen, for instance, as you watch TV shows, that you really don't find certain characters to be physically attractive to the extent that they're portrayed as incredibly annoying and evil? My husband does this all the time. I'll try to argue with him. No, this woman is objectively beautiful. This is how she made it as an actress. Clearly, she's beautiful. No, she is not beautiful. She is ugly. But he only thinks that because she is a really annoying character.
Is that like why like at the beginning of the show that there's that person
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure that's what's driving that effect, right? Again, suggesting how it's not totally objective. The people we like, we think are better looking than the people we dislike. We literally perceive them as less physically attractive. Even though that should have nothing to do with it, right? How likable a person is shouldn't have anything to do with physical features, but it does shape our perceptions of them. I, for instance, remember a real compelling experience that hit this home for me. I was riding a train with this man. We were traveling together on Elm, Chicago, and he was telling me about his daughter, and that they just had. She was turning 1, and he said, it's amazing how beautiful she is. It really is. We, are so impressed. In fact, we think we're going to, have to expose her to these people and maybe get some media press on it. So, and I was like, and he was being totally serious about it. I was like, okay, I'm kind of looking forward to seeing this awesome looking baby. And so he pulls out a photograph of her and shows the baby to me. And I remember thinking, cute? Not much beyond that, right? It's a cute baby, yeah, sure. But compared to my little baby sister, who is the most beautiful babe, and I remember thinking this. I remember thinking, oh, it's too bad for you. You haven't met my baby sister, and then you would know that it's not the most beautiful baby in the world because clearly mine is. And so I just remember then reflecting on that later on, thinking, okay, yeah, I also have this exact same biases that this man has. We both think that our respective little baby persons are course, it might have something to do with the Nazi posting hormone causes those types of things, but also my dad, I think, was maybe a little more objective. He called me Yoda. At the time. But again, love sees loveliness. I think that this sort of thing kind of comforts me. Theoretically, the longer you're with your significant other, the more physically attractive they're going to think you are, right? The more familiarity they're going to have with you. So maybe that will, take off the negative consequences of old age. That won't matter quite as much, right? Because it can be so biased to find you physically attractive. Any questions though about this before we move on? Okay. So I've got an unpleasant thought question for you guys. What do you think would be worse? You'll see a show of hands. If you think this would be worse, if your partner So maybe it would behoove a woman to find a mate who is emotionally faithful, who will stick around and who will provide. But what will it behoove men to find if they want to pass on their genes?
They'll need different girls.
Who are, in terms of faithfulness, what do we care more about? Sexual faithfulness or sexual faithfulness, right? Because we don't want to invest any time, even a couple minutes, right, with someone who's maybe already been with other men. Because then that other man's genes are going to be passed on, and not mine. So I'm going to value sexual faithfulness versus a woman might theoretically be more, find it more valuable to find a man who's emotionally faithful, who's going to stick around, right? Does that make sense? I mean, we find these gender differences too, or differences in ways, in real funny ways. For instance, one phenomenon that we found in the literature is that when babies are born, we're significantly more likely to say that they look like who? Dad, right? They look just like dad. In fact, the in-laws are actually more likely to say that. Why do you suppose that is?
Say, I mean, like I said, we don't know that baby is yours, so like, they wanna say, oh, they look like you, because that's reassuring, like, oh, okay, this kid's mine because he
Okay. There's zero doubt that this baby came out of the woman's body, right? That just happened, right? Versus, there's always that, however small it might be, there's always that shadow of a possibility that, maybe it was milkman's, right? We can't prove it necessarily beyond DNA testing, right? That it is for sure mine. And so to sort of quell that fear, to calm that lurking concern, and hopefully get that person to bond and stick around, you might say things to try to help assure dad. This looks just like you. So I always sort of felt bad when my sister had her baby because it did not look like her father. It looked just like her. Of course, she was totally faithful. I could not say anything about it, but you just really couldn't even say it looked like him because it was just her expressions and her nose, everything. And so I kind of felt bad. I was like, yeah, I guess it looks like you a little bit. I mean, you just clearly look like her. But I'm curious about whether or not that would happen. Whether or not people will think will say that it looks like interesting experience. Social science. All right, so we should also talk about research that really does illustrate additional gender differences that may support this evolutionary perspective on mate selection. Which now that we know the theory, what sorts of things do you think might happen? One study that I think is a real fun study. I always sort of wonder how it had to have been for these research assistants to go out into the world and conduct this study. But so what these research assistants, these were all Confederates, that they had to do was recruit or approach random individuals on campuses. So there were 5 men, there were 5 women who had to approach other people. Now these 5 men and 5 women, they were pre-rated in terms of being physically attractive. So their pre-ratings ranged from slightly unattractive to moderately attractive. So turns out that didn't matter. It didn't affect the results at all, how attractive these people were. But what these people were instructed to do was to approach someone that they would possibly approach, that they think is physically attractive enough to approach, and ask them 1 of 2 questions. They had to flip a coin after they had selected this person, so they couldn't selectively ask it to certain types of people and selectively ask it to others. They had to identify a person, then flip a coin. So it was truly a random assignment. This is what conditions was random. So they either had to say, let me get the exact text, I've been noticing you around campus, and I find you to be very attractive. Would you go out to dinner with me tonight? Versus, I've been noticing you around campus, and I find you to be very attractive. Would you go to bed with me tonight? So they had to ask 1 of 2 questions. So it was either women asking men versus men asking women. So in terms of this question, will you go out with me tonight? Do you think we find maybe gender differences in whether or not men versus women? Pretty much the same. Kind of flattering. Oh, that's nice. I might go out on a date with you tonight. Great. Turns out we don't find gender differences in response to this question. Approximately 50% of men and 50% of women will go out on a date with someone. get away from me, would be the typical response that they found for women versus men. What do you suppose their responses were? Really? So maybe similar questions, but in a different tone, right? Possibly. Yeah, it turned out that of the 30% of men who declined, most of them were actually fairly apologetic. I'm sorry, I'm really busy tonight, but how about tomorrow? Or, I'm so sorry, I'm married, but otherwise, that would have been fun. Or, things like that. So literally sort of a complete reversal in terms of how they're perceiving this type of thing. I mean, this is concerning, obviously. In fact, this study was conducted in the 1980s when we first sort of realized about the fear of certain types of very serious STDs like AIDS. Right? This is obviously a risky type of move to engage in. But we should talk about why we do find these gender differences.
Well, for women, I think they need to be more selective because if, no matter which partner you choose to have sex with, you're then, if you get pregnant, which biologically is your goal, then you're stuck with that for 9 months at least. And for a man, like, he could see you getting pregnant, go out the next guy and get another girl pregnant. So it's not a risk. It's like, whatever. So if you lose some, it's fine. But for a woman, like, she only has a certain number of reproductive years. She has to wait a really long time in between children. So it's not like she can just spawn a whole lot of offspring.
Quite possible, right? So maybe it fits in line with this evolutionary psych explanation, which is interesting too because now we live in a day where there are risks for men, right? It seriously could be bad for you to impregnate a woman that you're not going to want to stick around with, right? Guys, you have to pay a lot in child support fees, right? That's a financial investment, whether or not you know it, right? Versus women, maybe it isn't as much of a risk. Maybe you're on birth control. Maybe you are protected. Maybe there is no possibility of that. And yet still, in this modern day and age, we find these big gender differences, which I think suggests maybe there is some sort of evolutionary component.
Well, I would say it could be more social too, like women, there's still a stereotype where women can't just go sleep around with whoever they want, because that makes them a slut, but guys, brag with their numbers, and they do a good job, So it's more like, it could be more social than biological.
Oh, absolutely, right? There are different vocabulary for men who have multiple sexual partners versus for women who have multiple sexual partners. There's literally different languages or different terms we use for both of those groups of people.
I think the social norms and the social perceptions of those people might stem partly from the evolutional standpoint. Like, you're hardwired to think, men should be with a lot of people because they want to carry on the species, whereas women want to be with fewer because they need to make sure they're like females.
So what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? Maybe the evolutionary perspective sort of led to what we now find in our sociocultural climate. Negative attitudes toward women who are sexually promiscuous, we call them sluts, right? Versus positive attitudes toward men who are sexually promiscuous. Is there a term for them? Studs? I don't know, something like that, right? Sort of a good thing, right? You're congratulated for those types of activities. Versus you're sort of made fun of for those types of activities if you're a woman. So maybe maybe that's partly what might be driving this effect. Maybe we wouldn't find as many gender differences if society didn't have these attitudes toward men and women in these types of behaviors and what's appropriate and what's not. Is one possibility. In fact, we'll talk about these two competing explanations, which one there is more support for. The evolutionary psych perspective versus the social cultural perspective. Whether or not it's just society telling us, men and women, what we should do and what's appropriate, rewarding us or punishing us appropriately. We'll talk about the conflicting research. But before we do, we'll flesh out the research that supports this evolutionary psych perspective. For instance, additional research that supports it is research conducted by Buss. What they did was had men and women rank order various characteristics that they find as important in terms of mate selection. And here you find the list for women. type of stereotype, those types of things. Social status, age, of course, what do women prefer? Age-wise? Older, younger? Older, right? Older, theoretically more established, more financially stable. Ambition, dependability, intelligence, all markers of someone's going to be providing resources, right? Size and strength and good health. So they do matter too, right? Again, markers of fertility. The list is a little different for men. Waist suppose is the top marker, top four for men, right? Is it anything to do with economic capacity? Doesn't even make the list, right? So the list is shorter. And again, these are the markers of fertility, right? Youth is a marker of fertility. And they prefer younger individuals rather than older individuals. Physical beauty, body shape. You guys know what the ratio for body shape is? Hip to waist ratio? The hourglass figure, right? It's a 0.7 hip to waist ratio is theoretically supposed to be the most beautiful, the greatest, most attractive. And obviously chastity and fidelity, so we're finding gender differences in sexual jealousy. Men really value faithful individuals, sexually faithful individuals, right? Who are going to pass on their genes and not someone else's. Is this making sense? So I've actually got another little short video clip that we can watch that I think nicely explains this perspective, this evolutionary side perspective.
Women are the fairer, more ornamented sex, but in the animal kingdom, it's different. Males have developed elaborate adornments to attract the attention of would-be mates. Male peacocks have eye-catching feathers. There's the bold mane of a dominant lion. Human males don't sport such obvious anatomical adornments, but there's one thing they do have. Toys.
A car says a lot about you. It makes you look more stable. It makes you look better. It attracts more. It brings those eyes from the ladies. I mean, that's what it is. A car, in a way, makes you. It's what you drive is what you are.